a queen, every nobleman in the kingdom available to her, and she chose him. The one man everyone was afraid of. And I need you to stay with me, because by the end of this story, you are going to question everyone around you. In a kingdom built on tradition, where power was inherited and respect was everything, one decision shattered it all. The queen ignored every nobleman, every respected leader, and chose the one man everyone feared. A man known for his temper, his defiance, and his complete disregard for authority. People called him dangerous. Some called him cursed. But what no one understood was that this choice wasn't madness. It was strategy. Because within weeks of their marriage, secrets began to unravel. Powerful men were exposed, and a deadly plot came to light. One that could have destroyed the throne itself. So here's what I need you to think about as we go through this quiz. Was she out of her mind? Or was she the smartest person in that entire kingdom? Keep that question in your head, because the answer is going to surprise you. And before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because this is exactly the kind of story we bring you every week. Now, who was this man? Because to understand why she chose him, you first have to understand why everyone else was running from him. The one the entire kingdom had already judged long before the queen ever spoke his name. The man people avoided in the market. The one fathers warned their sons not to become. A man whose reputation had settled into the minds of the people like a permanent stain that could not be washed away. And yet somehow, out of every polished nobleman, every carefully trained court favorite, he was the one chosen to stand beside the most powerful woman in the land. And here's the part that nobody talks about. Because everybody focused on W show she chose. Nobody stopped to ask why. And the why changes everything. Why did she risk everything to choose him? Knowing her decision would shake the very foundation of her authority. That alliances could weaken, trust could fracture. That the same people who once supported her could begin to question her judgment, her sanity, even her right to rule. Because this was not a private decision. It was a public declaration that challenged everything the kingdom believed about power, order, and control. And it forced everyone watching to confront a question they were not prepared to. What if the person they feared the most was the one person the queen trusted completely? Because here's what people got wrong. They thought this was about him. It was never about him. It was about what she had already discovered. And that is where this story really begins. Because this wasn't a love story. Not in the way people wanted to believe. This was something far more deliberate, far more calculated. A decision made not from emotion, but from observation, from a deep understanding that sometimes the greatest threat to power does not come from enemies outside the gates, but from those standing closest to the throne, smiling, bowing, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Now on the surface, and I want you to pay attention here, because this is exactly how it works in real life, too. On the surface, everything looked complete. Roles were clearly defined. Expectations were rarely questioned. Marriage was never just about companionship. It was a calculated move to strengthen alliances and reinforce the balance of power. Everyone understood this, which is why the queen's choice mattered far beyond her personal life. She was expected to choose someone predictable, someone who would fit the system rather than disrupt it. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, cracks had begun to form. Decisions that didn't quite align. Resources disappearing without explanation. Individuals gaining influence faster than they should have. And yet no one spoke openly about it. Because in a place where appearances mattered, acknowledging instability itself, and I want to pause here for a second, because I need to know, have you ever been in a situation where something felt wrong, but everyone around you was acting like everything was fine? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now. Because that is exactly what the Queen was living. The Queen, however, was not someone who ignored patterns. She had spent years observing the people around her. And over time, she began to realize that the greatest threats were not loud or obvious. They were subtle, hidden behind politeness, concealed within routines that no one questioned. She began to test people in small ways. And what she discovered confirmed her worst suspicion. She was surrounded by individuals far more invested in protecting their own positions than the integrity of the kingdom. That is when her search began. Not for a husband in the traditional sense. She was not looking for charm or obedience. She was looking for resistance, for someone who could not be controlled, who would not bend under pressure or hide behind politeness when the truth needed to be spoken. And finding someone like that within the palace, impossible. Which is exactly why she looked outside the palace. And this right here is the decision that changed everything. So if you've been listening, stay with me because we're just getting to the part that nobody saw coming. Her attention shifted beyond the palace walls, toward the one man the kingdom had already dismissed. A man known not for cooperation, but for confrontation, not for diplomacy, but for directness. His reputation was built not through alliances, but through his refusal to participate in them. While most people saw that as a flaw, the Queen saw it as independence that could not be manufactured. He didn't soften his words, didn't pretend to agree when he didn't play by the unspoken rules that governed the kingdom's social order. In a world where everyone had learned to say what was expected rather than what was true, that refusal to conform was not a weakness. It was an advantage. And she was about to prove it in the most public, most uncomfortable, most unforgettable way possible. The day of the selection. Now, I need you to picture this. Because the entire kingdom believed they already knew how this was going to end. The day of the selection arrived with a sense of certainty. Favored candidates entered the court one by one. Polished, rehearsed, their answers designed not to reveal who they truly were, but to reflect what the court wanted to hear. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. Until his name was called, the shift in the room was immediate. Conversation stopped. Expressions changed. He carried none of the polish the others displayed. So effortlessly, and yet there he stood before the Queen. Not as a product of the system, but as someone entirely separate from it. When asked how he would treat her, he did not bow, did not offer praise, did not shape his answer into something acceptable. He simply told the truth. He said, respect could not be demanded without accountability. That loyalty could not exist without honesty. That if he were to stand beside the queen, it would not be as someone who blindly agreed with her, but as someone who would challenge her when necessary. Because power without truth was a risk no kingdom could afford. The room went completely silent, and I mean silent, not the silence of approval, the silence of something unexpected that cannot be undone. And in that silence, the queen looked at him, not with surprise, with recognition, like she had been waiting for exactly those words. Where others saw defiance, she saw consistency. Where others saw risk, she saw exactly what she had been looking for. And that was the moment everything changed. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Because once he was inside the palace was never the same again. And I mean that literally. From the very first morning, he questioned instructions others carried out without hesitation. He challenged decisions that seemed inefficient. He asked why certain tasks were done a particular way, why supplies were ordered in specific quantities, why procedures remained unchanged when they no longer served a clear purpose. His questions were not random. They were precise, directed at exactly the areas no one had examined too closely. And that precision made people deeply uneasy in a way they could not explain. And here's the thing. This happens in real life too. The most dangerous question you can ask inside any broken system is simply, why? Because the people benefiting from that system will never have a clean answer. Within days, the palace was no longer peaceful. Tension filled the corridors. People spoke more carefully, moved more cautiously. But something strange was happening at the same time. The queen, who had once carried the weight of quiet concern, began to appear calmer, more composed. While others saw chaos, she saw confirmation. And as the days passed, small irregularities became undeniable discoveries. Records that didn't align, resources misallocated. Decisions that benefited specific individuals without justification. Each discovery traced back to areas that had operated for years without scrutiny, where trust had replaced verification, and the assumption of integrity had allowed dangerous practices to go completely unchecked. But then, and this is the moment I really need you to pay attention to, then came the moment that nearly cost him everything. And I mean everything, in front of the entire court, in public, with no way to walk it back. In front of the entire court, during a formal public gathering, a gesture was made, an offering presented in a way that followed tradition, one that anyone in his position was expected to accept without hesitation. But he paused, and then he refused. Directly, publicly. Without explanation, the court erupted, not in chaos, in controlled outrage. Which is somehow worse. Because controlled outrage in a palace means people are calculating, and they were all calculating what this meant for him. Questions were demanded. To those already opposed to him, this was proof that he didn't belong, that the queen's decision had been a catastrophic mistake. At the time, it looked like he had just destroyed everything. But hours later, everything changed. And I am going to tell you what happened next. But first, I need you to understand something. Because what came out in those hours after, it wasn't just about him. It was about every single person who had called him dangerous, Every person who had smiled the loudest, bowed the deepest, and spoken the most carefully. Stay with me, because this is where it all comes apart. What followed began quietly. A single report surfaced, dismissed at first as coincidence, then another detail emerged. And another. And slowly, the narrative that had formed around his refusal began to collapse. Because what had looked like arrogance suddenly looked like instinct. The kind that doesn't explain itself in the moment but reveals its reasoning only after the fact. Behind the scenes, there had been signs for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Inconsistencies overlooked. Behaviors normalized because they fit within the structure people were used to. And now, under closer attention, those same elements began to look very different. Not isolated mistakes. A pattern. And a pattern that pointed not to error, but to intention. And here is who the suspicion settled on. Not strangers. Not outsiders. The inner circle, the people closest to the queen. The ones with the most access, the most influence, and the least scrutiny. Because in a system built on trust, proximity had replaced accountability. And that gap had been exploited for a very long time. Records that didn't match decisions, resources allocated to benefit specific individuals, action behind closed doors that never matched the outcomes presented publicly. Together, they formed a picture that could not be ignored. Those most confident in their positions began to show strain, a hesitation in their responses, a shift in tone, a sudden awareness of who was listening. The man everyone feared said nothing, made no accusations, simply continued to observe, to question, and to allow the inconsistencies to surface on their own. And that restraint created a pressure no formal accusation ever could. And now we get to the part that the queen had known from the very beginning. The part that makes this entire story make sense. Because she was never reacting. She was always 3 steps ahead. The truth did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself gradually, until what had once seemed confusing formed a clear and undeniable picture. The queen had not chosen him by accident. Her decision had been deliberate, shaped by the growing awareness that the system around her was no longer stable, and that the person she needed could not be found within it. She chose him because he could not be controlled, not by expectation. He could not be bribed, not because he had never been offered anything but because his decisions were not driven by gain or approval. That is Bratton Poldenties of speaking plainly in a place where silence was the safer choice. In a palace full of polite deception, he was the only one telling the truth. Think about that. The man everyone called dangerous was the only honest person in the building, and the people everyone trusted were the ones planning to destroy everything. And so, in the end, the man everyone feared became the most valuable ally the throne could have had. The one person whose integrity could not be bought, and whose courage could not be shaken. Meanwhile, those who carried the masks of respectability, who had smiled, bowed, and offered courtesy at every turn, were revealed to be the true threat. Their politeness had been hiding greed, manipulation, and betrayal so deep it had almost brought the kingdom to ruin. The final lesson was simple, and it is one most people learn too late. Appearances deceive, and sometimes the hardest, loudest, most confrontational person in the room is the one whose honesty and courage save everything that others only pretend to protect. So now, I need to ask you the real question. Not about the queen. About you. Is it better to trust someone who is kind or someone who is honest? Because in this story, the kind ones almost destroyed the kingdom, and the honest ones saved it. Think about the people around you right now. Which ones are kind and which ones are honest? And if stories like this speak to you, stories about real human choices, courage, and the kind of strength that gets mistaken for danger, subscribe. Because this is exactly what we do here, every single week. Hit the bell so you never miss the next one. And if you want to see another story that will genuinely change how you see people, the next one is right there, waiting for you.